stop scrolling right now, because what you are about to hear is not the story of a scandal. This is not the story of a feud. This is not the story of a family at war. This, for the first time in nearly a decade of relentless royal turbulence, is the story of a beginning. The quiet, deliberate, almost cinematic emergence of the most consequential young man in the British monarchy. And by the end of the next several minutes, you will understand exactly why historians, royal commentators, and palace insiders are all whispering the same single sentence to each other tonight. The future of the crown has just walked into the room. James, who turned 18 in December of 2025, has only recently begun embracing the attention that comes with his role inside the British royal family. The freshly graduated teenager is the son of Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, the youngest brother of King Charles, and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. The moment has finally arrived. And when it is officially confirmed, when the letters patent are sealed, when the decision is made absolute, the entire framework of the British monarchy will shift in a way that no tabloid headline, no Netflix documentary, and no transatlantic press conference could ever have predicted. Take a breath, because this is the moment you have been waiting for without even knowing you were waiting. A young man who spent 18 years quietly learning the art of power without ever once demanding it has just made the most consequential decision of his entire generation. James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten-Windsor, Earl of Wessex, has accepted the title of Prince, and in doing so, he has not merely claimed a name, he has claimed a destiny. He has become the rightful heir to the legacy of his grandfather, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. The silent engine of a monarchy that is no longer in crisis, but in full, deliberate, unstoppable ascent. But here is the question you need to sit with before we go any further. The question every casual observer is missing tonight. Why does this single moment matter so much? There have been princes before. There have been heirs and spares and titled royals cycling through the system for centuries. So what is it about this particular young man, at this particular moment, in this particular spring of 2026, that has the entire global royal watching community holding its breath? Stay with me, because by the time we reach the end of this story, you will understand that the acceptance of this title is not just a legal formality. It is the closing of a circle that began the very moment Prince Philip first took a young James fishing on the cold banks of the River Dee at Balmoral. It is the fulfillment of a promise made in silence, honored in service, and sealed in the most profound act of royal duty this generation has ever witnessed. So pay attention, because what comes next is going to redefine your entire understanding of what royalty in the modern age can be. Let us begin where every royal story should always begin, with the name itself, because every single word of this name carries meaning. James Alexander Philip Theo. Pause on the third name. The Philip is not accidental. It was placed there at the moment of his birth, with the full, deliberate, intentional weight of a family that understood, even at that earliest moment, that something different, something extraordinary, was at work in this child. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, was the defining force of the modern British monarchy for over 7 decades. He was the man behind the throne in the most literal possible sense, the architect of its internal culture, the enforcer of its discipline, the unyielding keeper of its most rigorous standards. He was not always loved by the press. He was not always understood by the public. He was, at times, gloriously misunderstood, but he was, without question, the structural backbone of an institution that has outlasted empires and outwitted republics. When James carries the name Philip, it is not ceremonial, it is a covenant, a promise wrapped inside a syllable. And when you look at this young man tonight, 18 years old, standing at the threshold of an official princely title, you see that covenant being honored in full, in flesh, in blood, in bearing. Think about this for one moment. Of all the grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II, of all the children who grew up in the orbit of that extraordinary couple who anchored the British state through a turbulent century, why was it James? the youngest, the quietest, the one deliberately, almost obsessively kept out of the public eye by parents who valued normality above all else. Why was it James who absorbed the deepest, most lasting lessons of Prince Philip's philosophy? Why was it James who spent those long, cold afternoons at Balmoral learning the art of fly fishing? That peculiarly aristocratic discipline of patience, of silence, of absolute environmental awareness. The other grandchildren had their own relationships with their grandfather, their own memories, their own inheritances. But the bond between Philip and James was something different, something rarer. It was almost as if the old Duke recognized in the youngest of the line the temperament that most closely mirrored his own, a young soul cut from the same austere, disciplined cloth. And that recognition, that almost mystical transmission across two generations, is the single most important thing you need to understand about the man James is becoming tonight. Now let us talk about the decision itself, because the acceptance of the His Royal Highness style by James Alexander is not as straightforward as it might appear to the casual observer. Under the current letters patent, the legal framework that governs royal titles in the United Kingdom, the choice was entirely his. He was not required to become a prince simply by virtue of turning 18. The entitlement existed in law, but the exercise of it, the decision to actually claim it, was a personal, deliberate, and entirely voluntary act. And that right there is what makes this moment so electrifying. Ask yourself this, honestly. When was the last time you saw a young man of extraordinary privilege, with every door already open, every benefit already available, every shortcut already laid out, choose not to take what was freely offered to him? When was the last time the heir to one of the most powerful names in modern history said, in effect, "I will take this title when the institution needs me to"? Not when my own desire for status demands it. That is precisely what James did. For years after turning the relevant age of eligibility, the whispers in the so-called Golden Triangle, that administrative heartbeat connecting Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Kensington Palace, were consistent. James was waiting, he was watching, he was learning, and he was, with quiet but absolute resolve, refusing to rush toward power simply because power was there to be grabbed. This is the fundamental difference between James Alexander and virtually every other royal story that has dominated the headlines for the past decade. Think about it. The narrative that consumed the world for years was built on the opposite impulse, the impulse to demand, to claim, to announce, to insist upon recognition, to take cameras into private moments and turn them into commercial products, to position oneself as a victim of the institution while simultaneously trading on it for personal gain. What we are witnessing now, in the spring of 2026, is the counter movement to all of that. It is quiet, it is deliberate, it is almost shockingly mature, and it is single-handedly redefining what it means to be a prince in the 21st century. But hold on, because no honest conversation about James can proceed without addressing the woman who is, by the universal consensus of every serious royal commentator in Britain today, the true architect of his extraordinary character, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh. You may know her as the quiet one, the one who never made headlines for the wrong reasons, the one who never had a public scandal, the one whose name has, for decades, been associated with discretion, dignity, and almost preternatural grace. But what most viewers do not know is that Sophie was, in palace circles, often privately described as the late Queen's favorite daughter-in-law, a woman whose judgment Elizabeth II trusted absolutely. A woman who was, in many ways, prepared for the longest possible game. Sophie made a decision at the very beginning of her marriage to Prince Edward that was so radical, so contrary to the established norms of the royal institution, that it raised eyebrows from Buckingham Palace all the way to St. James's. Sophie and Edward decided, together, that their children would not be styled as his or her Royal Highness. They would not carry princely titles into childhood. They would be raised deliberately and almost stubbornly as the children of an earl, grounded, ordinary in the very best possible sense of that word. Capable of navigating the real world without the automatic deference that a royal title commands. Why does this matter? Because it means that for the first 18 years of his life, James Alexander had to earn his place in every single room he walked into. He could not rely on the magic of a title to open doors or command respect from teachers or peers or strangers. He had to use his mind, his manners, his character, his genuine engagement with the world around him. He took public buses, he waited in queues, he learned painstakingly to speak to people from every background without the invisible wall of royal entitlement separating him from ordinary human experience. Can you understand what that does to a young person's psychology? Can you appreciate the difference between a child who grows up being told you are a prince, the world will come to you, and a child who is told instead you are a citizen with an extraordinary legacy, and you will have to prove yourself worthy of it every single day of your life? That right there is the foundation upon which James Alexander has been built. And it is a foundation made of granite. Sophie's genius, and make no mistake, it is genius, was in understanding that the monarchy of the future would not survive on the mythology of the past. It would need real people, people who actually understood the world, people who had genuinely lived in it, rather than merely waving at it from a balcony. In raising James the way she did, Sophie produced exactly that. She produced a royal who is authentic because he has been tested by reality. And now, as he steps forward to accept the full weight of his title and his legacy, that authenticity is his single most powerful asset. Now, let us return to Balmoral, because the story of James and Prince Philip, of the grandfather and the grandson who shared a temperament that seemed to skip several generations, is absolutely central to understanding why this title acceptance is so much more than a procedural announcement. Fly fishing. To those who do not know it, fly fishing sounds like a gentle, pastoral hobby, the kind of thing a wealthy man does on a pleasant afternoon. In reality, it is one of the most demanding and philosophically rich disciplines in the entire British aristocratic tradition. To fly fish successfully, you must stand in freezing water for hours at a time. You must calculate the precise speed of the current beneath your feet, the direction of the wind, the angle of the light on the surface, the subtle, almost imperceptible movements of the ecosystem around you. You must be perfectly, absolutely silent, not just in your body, but in your mind. Any fidgeting, any impatience, any noise, and the fish are gone. The river tells you nothing unless you are still enough to listen. Prince Philip understood this with the depth of a man who had spent decades cultivating his own internal discipline. He used fly fishing not just as a sport, but as a laboratory for the development of character. And it was in those long, quiet afternoons on the banks of the Dee, the water cold, the Highland air sharp with the smell of heather and pine, that the old Duke found, in his youngest grandson, the student he had perhaps been waiting for his entire life. James absorbed everything. Every lesson, the patience, the silence, the analytical observation of the environment, the understanding that you do not fight the current, you read it, you respect it, you work with its logic rather than against it. This is not a metaphor. This is a direct inheritance. This is the transmission of a way of being in the world. The stillness that the world now sees when James stands at a state ceremony, that absolute, unshakable composure that has left even veteran royal correspondents speechless at recent high-profile events, is the same stillness he learned standing in that river, the way his eyes move through a room, taking in everything, committing to nothing prematurely. That is the same analytical focus that fly fishing demands of every serious practitioner. Prince Philip, through those quiet lessons at Balmoral, did not just teach his grandson how to fish. He taught him how to rule. And there is something profoundly, almost unbearably moving about that continuity. Philip is gone now. The world mourned him. The monarchy felt the absence of his structural force in ways it is still frankly processing. But in James Alexander, a direct line of inheritance runs. Not of blood alone, but of character, of discipline, of philosophy. When James accepts the title of prince, he is, in a very real and very literal sense, completing a transmission that began beside a cold Scottish river. And that was meant, from the very beginning, to outlast the man who started it. But there is a single image from recent royal history that, more than any other, defines the essence of James Alexander. And if you have not seen it, you absolutely need to understand what happened at Westminster Hall during the lying in state of Queen Elizabeth II. Picture the scene. In that vast ancient chamber, surrounded by the most senior members of the royal family, watched live by tens of millions of people around the world, the grandchildren of the late queen stood vigil over her coffin. James was 14 years old. Think about that for a moment. Really sit with the weight of it. 14 years old, in the full, blinding glare of the most scrutinized royal event of the entire 21st century. Standing guard over the body of his grandmother, the woman who had been the most recognizable human being on earth for 70 years, the emotional pressure of that moment, the grief, the gravity, the sheer crushing weight of history compressed into that single room was something that had reduced experienced statesmen to visible distress. And here was a 14-year-old boy. He did not fidget, he did not look around, he did not show even the smallest trace of the self-consciousness that any normal teenager would have displayed in that environment. He stood with his head bowed and his expression a perfect mask of absolutely dignified concentration. He was not performing composure. He was not pretending to be older than he was. He was simply doing what he had been prepared, by character and by upbringing, to do. He was honoring a duty. He was representing a lineage. He was standing as a soldier stands, not for himself, but for something immeasurably larger than himself. That moment was seen by millions, and for those who were paying attention, the serious royal commentators, the palace insiders, the constitutional scholars, it was the moment that changed the conversation about James Alexander permanently. This was not a child being put on display. This was a young man of moral seriousness, stepping into a role with a gravity that had no business existing at 14 years old, but was undeniably, powerfully, unmistakably present. From that moment forward, the question was no longer whether James would play a significant role in the monarchy. The question became, instead, exactly how significant. Now fast forward to his recent global debut, the South African tour. The trip that served in effect as the world's formal introduction to a young man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of moment, without ever having been officially titled. James's behavior on that tour was studied with the kind of intense analytical attention that is usually reserved for seasoned heads of state. And what emerged from that scrutiny was a portrait of someone who is, in every meaningful sense, already operating at the level the title now confirms. What observers noted, again and again, was a pattern that defied every expectation of how a young royal should behave. Rather than positioning himself at the center of conversations, which would have been entirely appropriate for someone of his standing, James repeatedly took a literal step back. He positioned himself on the periphery of interactions. He listened. His eyes moved through the room with a quiet, intelligent focus, reading body language, assessing emotional temperature, absorbing the dynamics of every conversation before contributing a single word. In diplomatic circles, this technique has a name. It is called active listening. It is considered one of the most sophisticated skills in the entire repertoire of high-level international engagement. Most professionals take years to develop it. Many never fully master it. Some of the most seasoned diplomats in the world, people who have spent 30 years navigating heads of state and foreign ministers, admit privately that true active listening remains elusive because the pressure of the environment constantly pulls the focus back to oneself, to how one appears, to what one will say next, to managing the impression being created. James deployed it naturally, instinctively, as an extension of his temperament rather than as a learned technique. When he did speak, it was not with a scripted platitude or a ceremonial pleasantry. It was with a specific, nuanced observation that demonstrated genuine comprehension and genuine care about what the other person had said. The impact was extraordinary. Conservation leaders who had greeted dozens of royals over the course of their careers came away from those interactions visibly moved by the quality of James's attention. Local community leaders who had braced themselves for the slightly detached politeness of official diplomacy found themselves in what felt like a real conversation with someone who actually wanted to understand their world. Veteran journalists who covered the tour found themselves almost against their professional instincts, writing not about what James said or did, but about the quality of his presence. A thing almost impossible to quantify and almost impossible to fake. This is the gift of Sophie's upbringing and Philip's fishing lessons combined, and made manifest in a young man who understands that the most powerful thing a representative of the crown can offer is not their title, but their genuine, undivided human engagement. There is another dimension to the South African tour that deserves close attention, because it speaks directly to why the palace has moved with such strategic deliberateness in positioning James as it has. During the entire tour, James was not styled as a prince. He was attending in his capacity as the Earl of Wessex, a title of significant nobility, but one that carries none of the automatic deference of the His Royal Highness style. And yet, in room after room, conversation after conversation, the people he met treated him with a respect and a genuine warmth that no title had manufactured. He earned it in real time. He commanded it through character. This is precisely the outcome Sophie engineered 2 decades ago, when she and Edward made their revolutionary decision about how their children would be raised. And in South Africa, watching it play out on the world stage, the palace knew with absolute certainty that the bet had paid off beyond anyone's most optimistic expectations. Now, let us address directly what everyone in the royal watching community has been quietly discussing in increasingly unguarded terms. The departure of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex created a structural problem for the British monarchy that went far beyond the personal and the emotional. It created a manpower crisis at a moment of maximum institutional pressure. The working royal family, the core group of individuals who carry out the thousands of patronages, engagements, overseas tours, and ceremonial duties that constitute the daily operational life of the crown, was left with a significant gap. For years, various solutions were discussed, various candidates were considered, various structural adjustments were made, but none of them fully addressed the underlying problem, which was not simply one of numbers, but of character. The monarchy needed a young royal who combined genuine public appeal with absolute institutional loyalty, someone who could be trusted not just with a patronage or a foreign tour, but with the long-term strategic integrity of the crown itself. The palace has now found that person. And the extraordinary, almost poetic irony is that they found him not by looking outward, not by seeking new arrangements or new alliances, but by looking right at the young man who had been quietly, diligently, almost invisibly preparing for exactly this role his entire life. James is not replacing anyone. He is not a substitute or a consolation prize. He is, in the view of those closest to King Charles III and the Prince of Wales, the superior solution, not because of what others lacked, but because of what he uniquely possesses. What does he possess? Let us be specific. He possesses the stoicism and the institutional loyalty of Prince Philip. He possesses the grounded, real-world empathy that comes from 18 years of navigating ordinary life as a private citizen. He possesses a science, technology, engineering, and mathematics-focused analytical mind that equips him to engage with the most pressing issues of the modern world: climate science, defense technology, ecological engineering, institutional efficiency, with genuine depth, not just royal courtesy. He possesses a relationship with the Prince of Wales that insiders describe as the most important alliance in the current royal family, a partnership of genuine mutual respect and shared purpose. That echoes the bond William has long sought and never quite found elsewhere. And crucially, he possesses the discretion that the modern monarchy depends upon. He has not told his story to a streaming platform. He has not sat in front of a camera and processed his emotions for global consumption. He has lived his life quietly, served his family faithfully, and allowed his character to speak through his actions rather than his words. In an era of radical transparency that has so often corroded royal authority, James has maintained the mystique. He has kept the mystery. And in doing so, he has made himself, paradoxically, the most compelling figure in the entire royal family. But here is something the mainstream coverage of James Alexander has consistently underreported. And it is, perhaps, the most significant aspect of his profile from the perspective of the monarchy's long-term future. James is not just a beautiful young royal with good manners and a talent for ceremonies. He is a genuinely, intellectually formidable young man with a deep, serious engagement with the world of science and technology. This matters enormously. Think about the challenges the British monarchy faces in the 21st century. It must prove its relevance to a public that is increasingly skeptical of hereditary privilege. It must engage credibly with the defining issues of the age: climate change, technological disruption, geopolitical realignment, ecological crisis. It must function, as King Charles III has long insisted, as a high-performance institutional machine, and not just as a ceremonial relic. To do these things, the working royal family needs members who do not just lend their names to worthy causes, but who actually understand what those causes involve at a technical and strategic level. James is that member. His interest in conservation, for example, is not the soft, photogenic engagement with cute animals that can characterize celebrity environmentalism. It is a rigorous, engineering-minded engagement with ecosystems as complex systems that need to be understood, modeled, and managed with data-driven precision. His interest in the military is not merely a love of ceremonial uniforms and regimental history. It is a strategic, analytical engagement with defense networks, logistical systems, and the technical hardware that protects national security. When James sits in a briefing, he does not need everything translated into layman's terms. He brings his own analytical framework to the table. King Charles III has recognized this with what insiders describe as a quiet but intense relief. The king, who has spent decades championing causes that were often dismissed as eccentric, before the world finally caught up with his thinking on organic farming, architectural heritage, and ecological sustainability, now has, in his nephew, a young man who shares his intellectual seriousness and brings it to a new generation with a fluency in the language of the digital age. James is the bridge between the king's wisdom and the world's future. But this brings us, inevitably, to the relationship that will define the next reign, because the partnership between James Alexander and the Prince of Wales is the centerpiece of everything that is about to unfold. To understand it, you need to understand what William has been carrying for the past several years. The future king of the United Kingdom is a man of immense capability and genuine dedication. But he is also a man who has been navigating an increasingly complex institutional landscape with a reduced inner circle, the family he grew up in. Close, complex, sometimes fractured, has left him in a position where the question of whom he trusts absolutely, whom he can speak to without calculation, whom he can rely on to prioritize the institution over their own profile and personal narrative, has never been more pressing. James is the answer to that question. The age gap between them, nearly 2 decades, might seem significant, but in the architecture of royal relationships, it is almost ideally calibrated. James is young enough to learn from William, to defer to his authority without competition, to genuinely look up to the future king as a mentor and a model. But he is old enough and mature enough to provide real strategic support, to be a genuine intellectual partner, rather than simply a deferential junior. This balance is extraordinarily rare, and William has recognized it with the clarity of a man who has been searching for it for a very long time. Sources within the palace suggest that William has taken a personal and direct interest in James' development. That goes beyond the formality of a senior royal mentoring a junior. He sees in James the younger brother in spirit that he, in many ways, lost. Not a replacement for what was, but a fulfillment of what the role of the loyal royal sibling was always meant to be. Where previous incarnations of that role were driven by personal ambition or emotional volatility, James brings to it something that William has been quietly desperate for: absolute, conscious, freely chosen loyalty, rooted not in obligation, but in genuine belief in the institution and genuine love for the man who will lead it. When William eventually ascends to the throne, and that transition, whenever it comes, will be one of the most scrutinized moments in modern British history. He will not face it alone. He will face it with James by his side, and the world will see what the palace already knows, that the most important alliance in the British monarchy is not between a king and his ministers, or between a monarch and the press, but between a sovereign and the man who chose freely, deliberately, against all the temptations of a comfortable private life, to stand beside him. Consider the historical parallels for a moment, because they are instructive and they are sobering. The great monarchies of history, the ones that endured, were never built on a single extraordinary individual. They were built on systems of loyal support, on the relationships between sovereigns and their most trusted inner circles. That held the institution upright through the inevitable storms. The House of Windsor has understood this in theory for decades. In James, it now possesses it in practice, a young man of royal blood, royal training, and, crucially, genuine personal conviction about the value of what the crown represents. That combination has not existed in the second tier of the royal family for a very, very long time. And the palace knows it, which is precisely why the elevation of James Alexander has been handled with such deliberate, unhurried care. You do not rush the installation of a load-bearing column. You make sure it is perfectly positioned before you commit the full weight of the structure to it. James is positioned, the weight is coming, and from everything the world has seen, he is more than ready to bear it. So, what does it mean in practical terms now that James Alexander has formally accepted the His Royal Highness style and taken on the title of Prince? What changes? What begins? And what does it tell us about the next chapter of the House of Windsor? First, and most immediately, it completes the constitutional architecture that King Charles III has been building since his accession. A streamlined monarchy focused on a core group of working royals who carry the full weight of the institution's public duties has always been the king's vision. James's formal entry into that inner circle provides the structural reinforcement that the working royal family has needed. He is not a peripheral figure being added to the guest list. He is a load-bearing pillar being installed into the foundation. Second, it triggers a cascade of official responsibilities, patronages, military affiliations, diplomatic duties that will begin to flow to James from the existing royal portfolio. His science and technology background makes him the natural champion of the patronages most critical to the monarchy's modern relevance: environmental science, defense, technology, educational innovation, infrastructure sustainability. These are not decorative roles. They are active, engaged partnerships between the crown and the institutions that are building the future of this country. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, it sends a message to the British public and to the wider Commonwealth that reaches far beyond the individual. It says that the monarchy is capable of renewal. Renewal that is not driven by crisis or external pressure, but by deliberate, principled, long-term strategic thinking. It says that there are young people within the royal family who understand what service means, not as a public relations strategy, not as a personal brand, but as a genuine, total commitment of one's life to something larger than oneself. The acceptance of the title of Prince by James Alexander is not the end of a story. It is the beginning of one, and history, when it looks back on this moment from the distance of decades, will recognize it as one of the most significant turning points in the evolution of the British monarchy in the 21st century. Here is the legacy of Prince Philip made new. Here is the stoicism, the technical mind, the fierce institutional loyalty, the absolute refusal to be defined by celebrity or personal narrative. All of it alive in a young man who inherited it not just through blood, but through those long, cold, silent afternoons on the river. Through a mother's revolutionary courage to raise her son as a citizen before a prince, and through his own conscious, deliberate daily choice to prepare himself for a duty that nobody was requiring him to take on. Here is the answer to every question the monarchy has faced about its relevance, its durability, its capacity to adapt without losing its soul. Not in noise, not in controversy. Not in the manufactured drama of transatlantic narratives and streaming confessionals. Here, in the quiet, focused, absolutely devoted young man who has just accepted a title he earned before he ever bore it. What should not be underestimated is the cultural statement that James's title acceptance makes to an entire generation of young people. Young people who have grown up watching the British monarchy navigate its most turbulent period since the abdication crisis. For many of them, the dominant royal narrative of the past decade has been a story of entitlement versus escape, of people born into extraordinary privilege, either clinging to it or fleeing it, but in both cases remaining defined entirely by it. James offers something radically different. He offers the story of a person who had every reason to live a comfortable, private, unobligated life, and who chose, with full awareness of the cost, to give that life in service of something larger. That is not a narrative of privilege. It is a narrative of sacrifice. And in a world that is exhausted by the former and starving for the latter, it is a story that resonates at a frequency deeper than any headline can ever capture. The palace, to its considerable credit, has understood this. The strategic elevation of James has not been conducted as a public relations exercise. It has not been dressed up in the language of celebrity or positioned for maximum social media engagement. It has been allowed to unfold organically, at the pace that James's own development has dictated. In the quiet, dignified register that has always been his natural mode. The world has been watching, and what it has seen, what it is still seeing, as the implications of this title acceptance continue to reverberate through the corridors of power, is a young man who makes the concept of duty seem not like a burden, but like a calling. That is Prince Philip's ultimate legacy. Not the titles, not the patronages, not the decades of ceremonial service. Extraordinary, as all of that was. The ultimate legacy is the transmission of a philosophy, a way of being in the world that prizes inner discipline over external validation, that finds meaning in responsibility rather than recognition, that understands that the measure of a life is not how much attention it attracted, but how much genuine good it achieved in the quiet spaces where cameras never reach. That philosophy has now found its next steward, and his name is James Alexander Philip Theo Mountbatten-Windsor, the prince who chose duty, the heir to Philip's legacy, the silent guardian of the crown's future, the lieutenant who will make a king feel less alone on the throne. Do you understand now why this moment matters? Do you see why the royal watching world is not just watching this story, but holding its breath in something that feels remarkably close to hope? Because the truth is, the monarchy has not just gained a prince today. The country has gained a guarantee that when the next chapter of this ancient institution opens, when the crown passes, when a new king stands in that moment of maximum vulnerability and maximum responsibility, there will be a man standing beside him who has spent his entire life preparing to be exactly what the throne needs, not its heir, not its rival, its most trusted ally, its strongest support, its quiet, steely, absolutely devoted foundation. The British monarchy has survived 800 years of wars, revolutions, abdications, and social upheaval. It has survived because, in each generation, it has found the person it needed precisely when it needed them. In the spring of 2026, it has found James Alexander and the House of Windsor. Quiet, focused, absolutely devoted, moves forward. The prince who stayed is now officially a prince, and the future of the crown has never been more certain. If you have made it this far, you already know that this story is far from over. The real chapters are just beginning. Hit that subscribe button, because as James steps further into his official role in the months ahead, every development is going to be worth watching, and you do not want to miss a single moment of what comes next. The new era has begun, and it began with a young man on a riverbank learning how to be still.